So for me, being able to create a webinar around navigating change, I think is probably one of the most useful sessions that I'm likely to do. Change is inevitable, that we are going to have change. Some change that comes is huge. Some of it, you would argue, such as COVID, you couldn't have predicted. But what I would argue is that the success of charities, voluntary organisations, indeed any organisations, the success comes from being able to, as far as possible, anticipate change and then focus on the opportunities as well as mitigating the risks. So it's really about organisations being able to horizon scan and be able to say, you know, what changes are coming and how do we prepare and plan for them. And that's very challenging, particularly in the charity sector, which is heavily regulated, where, you know, arguably, you know, there are more limited opportunities for you to kind of switch direction and move where you're going. But still within that, I think there are opportunities for organisations, and that's what I want to talk about today. So I'm going to go through a number of slides with you. People that are participating on the webinar will have been sent a case study, and what I would what we will ask Medrwn to do is to ensure that people that want to download the webinar can also access that case study, because I think sometimes it's really useful if you're able to look at an actual example. So you've got that, and we can chat about that at the end. You know, I would say over the last 4 or 5 years, there's been unprecedented change, significant changes hitting all of us, but really focusing on the voluntary and community sector and the impact that that has had. Brexit, you know, regardless of whether or not your organisation received European funding, had a huge knock-on effect, because those organisations that relied on European funding, when that funding came to an end, joined the rush for other funding, which was, you know, a limited amount of funding. Brexit also impacted the amount of investment that charitable trusts invested, because the market was so unpredictable. And you know, your charitable trusts, your Esme Fairburn, Sainsbury's, those kind of organisations, the way that they create money that they can share out to charities is they invest it. But if the market is unpredictable, they don't invest. If they don't invest, then they don't have funds to share. So Brexit had a huge and lasting impact, I think, on a number of organisations. And that obviously leads on with market uncertainty. COVID-19, we could never have predicted that. The issue of that, and I'm sure any of you that have had organisations that have gone through that, after the stark panic, you know, the once in a lifetime, how on earth do we continue to deliver during this, saw the most kind of innovative changes in the ways people would deliver services, and a real need for them. And what happened was also you saw funders recognising a significant crisis and say, right, how do we respond to that? They brought a lot of funding forward, and what we're seeing now is funding that would have normally been available not being available. Cost of living crisis, I think, has hit, because that means there's greater demand for services, but also the cost of delivering those services. And again, you know, organisations are suddenly finding that there are, you know, the way that they deliver their services and the cost of delivering those services has had a significant impact. And then finally, things like increases to the minimum wage and national insurance contributions, which I think we all, particularly people wanting to, you know, working with individuals who are experiencing in work poverty or lower salaries, would say, you know, increasing the minimum wage and NI contributions has got to be a good thing. The problem is it landed on the charity sector without much warning, and then there's very limited availability, opportunity for people to then say, okay, well, I'm going to start putting funding bids in, and I'm going to, apply for more funding. So we know there are these significant seismic changes that impact the voluntary and community sector, which can take a real sideswipe. But there are also lots of other changes that aren't that significant, aren't as kind of global as that, and which, if we can predict them and we can approach them in a positive way, can be managed in a much better way. And I want to go on and kind of talk about that now. Change presents threats, but it also changes opportunities. And the success of organisations, of those that are able to ride the wave, and they're able to say, wow, this has happened, but let's look for the opportunities within it. And that can often be a real challenge, because people can often fear change, particularly if you've got organisations that are steeped in tradition, where their unique selling point, if you like, is their traditional way of doing things, their traditional delivery, their kind of history. But I think, given the environment we're operating in, we've really got to start seeing, we've got organisations to have a much more positive approach to change, and say, do you know what, it's going to come, changes are going to come, we need to be ready for it as far as we can, and be able to engage with it positively. And the first thing of that is around preparation. Preparation is absolutely essential for change management. And what that is about horizon scanning. It's about saying, are there any changes in policy? Are we seeing new policies coming out of Welsh Government which could have a positive or negative impact on us? Are we seeing UK, changes or changes in Europe which still indirectly can have an impact on us? Local authorities, if you're relying on funding for them, are they starting to talk about changing their priorities, or the way that they commission services? Those kind of things, if you see them on the horizon, you can start getting ready for them. So preparation is really essential. And having a plan A and also a plan B for organisations, again, what that does is it inspires confidence. So often when I'm brought into an organisation to do change management, all the answers aren't there immediately. You go in and you say, okay, we've got a problem, we need to be able to respond to that. And sometimes that's about saying, right, let's get a plan A, but let's also be prepared to adjust that and look at a plan B. But what plans give, they give you certain level of control. They give you, service users, your partners, your staff and your volunteers, a feeling that actually somebody's got this. So being ready for change and being able to predict change as far as possible, and having a plan, is absolutely, I think, essential to being able to deliver on effective change. And then recognizing that even what may feel like the most devastating threats, so for example, loss of funding, could result in significant changes in the way organisations operate. But is there an opportunity there as well as a threat for you to be able to make something of that? So for each potential issue that is going to force change on your organisation, to be able to look at it and say, okay, what are the threats? How do we minimise the threats? How do we mitigate the threats? But also, where are the opportunities in this? We saw huge opportunities during COVID for hybrid working, and working like we do now online, which for organisations, particularly rural organisations, like the organisations that many of you operate in, means that you can deliver services that before would take a day going out and meeting people face to face. So, we're all familiar with Teams now. We're all familiar with Zoom. We didn't have that pre-COVID. It was Skype, largely. That was what people used, and most of us didn't use it. People respond differently to change. Some people embrace change. They say, yeah, come on, let's go with it. There are people that will be very nervous and have lots of anxiety around change. And so what I would say is, if you are facing changes in your organisation or predicting change in your organisation, is to create a strategy. That strategy might need to change, but at least you've got a plan. And that says, right, we're going to start off, we're going to look at these risks. Let's think about what are the things that we can do. What resources do we need? What expertise do we need? Who within the team do we need to engage? All those kind of things are really, really important in a change situation. And interestingly, if an organisation approaches change in a positive way, it can have a real impact in terms of gelling teams, bringing people together to work collectively to overcome a challenge. I've seen organisations where culturally the people have felt quite disparate, they felt quite isolated, they felt quite unsupported, they haven't really felt what their role is in the organisation. An external threat comes which has required change within the organisation, and if it's managed properly, you actually see people gelling, support coming together. So there are, again, opportunities when we talk about change. As I think I've said, understand the psychology of change. It absolutely, you have to recognise that people are impacted differently by change. Some people will welcome it. Some people will say, do you know what, take me on a journey. I'm up for that. Some people will want structure. They want to know, what are we going to be doing first? What are we going to be doing next? Who's going to be doing what? And what are the timescales? If people need that, then that's what you've got to give them as part of that change process. Some people will want to know the whys. Some people will say, I'm up for this, but I need to understand why. Don't take me on a journey if you can't explain to me why we need that. So people that need the understanding of why we've got to have this change. And then there are people that say, come on, let's get on and do it. Let's not prevaricate. Let's not mess around. They need action. Those are the kind of people that it's really good to get them busy early on and get them doing things. And then the other one are team people, and they want to know that everybody's going to be okay. People that will really want to make sure that through this change process, everybody's being listened to and everybody is being considered. So recognizing that, even though you might say, look, change is essential. If we don't change, we're closing. And that might absolutely be true. It's also really important to be able to take people along. If you use volunteers, you need to take volunteers along as well as your paid staff. There's generally an emotional cycle to change, this idea of denial. So people, no, we can manage. They are going to give us the funding. They've always given us the funding. They would not give us the funding. And then the resistance, which really says, look, we can't change. We've always done it like that. If we change, we're going to, we're going to die. We're not going to succeed as an organisation. People know us for what we do, and if we change, we're going to lose supporters and we're going to lose beneficiaries, and our volunteers will go. The next one is the exploration, and this is really, once you've dealt with the first two, it's really about getting people on board, to be part of the change. Too often people try and create change at a senior management level and do it to other people. And if you do that, you will find that the resistance period lasts much longer because people want to be part of the change. So if you can get everyone exploring it, this is what we're thinking, this is the plan that we're thinking, can anybody see any, anything that we could do better or differently. And then once you've got the commitment, then you've got, you know, a whole organisation approach to change, and that's really, really critical. So supporting and empowering staff, I think, is really important. Recognising that individuals respond differently is all really, really important. Now, for those people that are participating on the webinar firsthand, I've provided for you an example, because I think it's always really useful to have an example of how this is a mythical organisation, Hope Haven, have responded to the psychology of change. So what we looked at there was an organisation that faced a significant loss of funding, 40% of the funding that they'd relied on for a number of years. And this is a homelessness charity, so a charity that deals with people that are really vulnerable anyway, and that you know, the fear that they're not going to have that support can have a huge impact on staff and staff morale. So what they did was they realised that, do you know what, the best way to keep the staff and the volunteers engaged is to keep them updated. Often when you've got an anxious position or you've got an anxious situation, people fear giving that information to staff and volunteers, because you say, well, if we give it them, it will worry them. But what worries people more than anything is not knowing. And believe me, if you don't tell people what is going on, they'll make it up. And what they make up will be far more creative and probably a lot more scary than the reality. So in this case study, what Hope Haven did was that they held a staff and volunteering briefing to acknowledge the uncertainty but provide as much clarity as they could, which said, do you know what? We're facing this loss of funding, but this is what we're going to be doing to look to replace it. They tried to explain why the funding was lost so that they were able to evidence to people it's not something that we've done, this is just the way it is. They allowed people to voice their concerns and contribute their ideas. And this is something I think for organisations, if you're going through this webinar and you're wanting to use it in a more interactive way, and I noticed a proofreading mistake there, is to think about changing your own organisation and how you communicated that change. Because sometimes stopping looking at when did we have a big change in our organisation, what happened that made it that forced some kind of change on us, and how did we respond to it? Did we have the change being initiated by a small number of people, and that information was given to staff and volunteers as and when that leadership team felt that it was necessary? Or was it that you said, you know what, let's involve everybody in this and let's participate in everyone? So poor communication can make change harder. If you don't share sufficient information, speculation will be rife, and try not to guess. So don't, you know, be able to say, this is what we know, this is how we're going to respond to it. Demonstrating that you have a plan is hugely important, because it gives confidence, particularly to those people that want to see structure. And being able to give people a role in that plan as well provides power and some element of control. And focus on the solution rather than focusing on the doom. And it's very easy in a situation like that where people feel that they've been sideswiped because you've always had funding, for example, and then all of a sudden they haven't. But thinking again, what do people need in order to be able to bring them on board so that we can do this together? And then look for practical strategies to keep staff and volunteers engaged during transitions is another way for you to positively engage people in change. There's a term that I use a lot, and I use it particularly where I'm managing change in quite a critical situation where either the organisation is closing or considering closing, or there's an existential threat, or merging, and that is own the narrative. So in external communication, you have to be the one giving the messages out, and that is so, so important, because if you let messages go out that aren't yours, that's where funders, partners, beneficiaries, staff and volunteers all start getting very worried about that. So be very clear about what are the messages that we need to put out to external partners about what has happened to us and what we're doing about it, and make sure that that strategy is very, very clear, and that you're communicating that in a way that is coherent and that people that will accept and understand. So own the narrative, I think, is really important. Often people will put something on their website, on social media, saying that you may be aware that we face significant changes in our organisation. This is what we know, and this is what we're doing about it as a team. If you need to know more, contact us. So definitely, I think that's one of the most important takeaways, I would say. So what did Hope Haven do? They provided weekly update emails, remembering as well, if you've got staff that are fractional or work remotely or are on outreach, they often get missed out of change communication. So emails are quite a good way of saying, this is where we are, this is what we know, this is what we've done. But again, forums where staff are able to communicate and come online and say, look, I'm really anxious about this. Should I be looking for another job? Is my job at risk? That people can be able to speak is a really, really important. And then another opportunity, which was discussed in the case study, is enabling a staff representative to attend board meetings. Now, it may be that they attend part of the board meeting, and this is in addition to your CEO. It may be that they attend for the part where the board are dealing with the change process and what change needs to happen. Because what that does is it allows staff to understand that this is not something remote that's being done to them, and that the board take it seriously, that the board are considering that and how that will impact on operations. And then again, if you're using this webinar as a kind of interactive tool and you wanted to reflect on that, then what I would say is thinking about how information is shared in your organisation. Do you share information in a way that's timely? It's appropriate? Is there the opportunity for two-way feedback? And do you have a culture where people feel that they can feedback? If you've never had that, then often staff will feel that, and volunteers may feel that actually nobody ever asked me, so it's not really my place to say. And again, going back to the psychology of change, then you can have a much more positive impact on your organisation if you encourage people to participate and to communicate back. Scenario planning. Scenario planning starts now, not when you have an existential threat. We all have fire drills. We don't have a fire drill just before the printer catches fire. We have a fire drill in case the printer catches fire, or if something else happens. So scenario planning matters because it gives you a dry run at what ifs. What if we lost our funding? What if we lost key members of staff? What if commissioning changed at the local authority and we were no longer able to tender for work? What if? Because if you've if you scenario planned for it, if you said the what ifs, when it happens, you're familiar. And that is incredibly important when people are feeling powerless and feeling like, gosh, I don't know what we're gonna, I don't know how to deal with that. It removes or reduces the headless chicken scenario. So if you identify potential risks and opportunities, so what could happen? And if that happened, what would you do? Who would be involved? Who's your initial team? And it doesn't necessarily have to be the senior management team. Yes, they will be involved, but are there other staff that you would say, do you know what? If something happens, we need to have a team of people. And there's no surprise that I use the term risk with change intermittently, because change is often driven by a risk. It's often it is often driven by a change in something or a loss of something. But if you're able to scenario plan for change, then that familiarity gets the team much better in terms of being able to look at, what are we going to do? Mapping out different response strategies creates power and confidence within the leadership team and the whole organization. If this happens, this is how we're going to address it. This is what we're going to do. But then ensuring flexibility in decision making. And again, drawing on my own experience of change management, particularly in critical situations, people are often reluctant to make decisions until they have all the information. But in actual fact, that's a decision. That's a decision not to act. And sometimes you have to make tentative decisions. Right, this is how we're going to respond. These are the changes we're going to make. But you know what? Something else might happen and we may need to review that. And that is change on the move. That is change on the move. And as long as you look at it, given our best, given the information that we have at the moment, what's the best decision? But if something else happens, we may need to change that. But that's okay, because we're going to adjust and reflect based on the information that is available at the time. So scenario planning, just think about your fire risk. You don't have fire, you don't have fire drills because you're anticipating a fire. It's just in case. Because if there really is a fire, people need to know where to go, who's going to have the board and all that kind of stuff. This is exactly the same. Same principles apply. And again, if you were looking at this to look at this webinar from an interactive point of view, the case study that I provided offered a 3-tier contingency plan with actions for each scenario, and that has a really profound impact on the psychology of change. So if you say, do you know what, if this happens, if the worst happens, this is what we're going to do. If something slightly less bad happens, this is what we're going to do. But if something minor happens, then this is what we're going to do. It gives confidence. It says to people, we're on this, we're ready for it. In the example, they also developed a major fundraising campaign. And sometimes that can be a real opportunity, because if you are beneficiary facing, then often the fundraising is done last minute. Gosh, we're going to need some money soon. We're going to need, we need to continue this piece of work. Whereas if you have a threat, a major fundraising campaign can raise the profile of the organisation, focus lots more people's attention on fundraising, which is often left to 1 or 2 people in the organisation, and really generate some dialogue within the community about what's important about this organization. So those kind of threats can really be used for, when we talk about owning the narrative, to say, look, you know what, if we're not here, this is the impact it's going to have on our community. So again, scenario planning and looking for opportunities are really important. In the case study, Hope Haven also engaged staff and volunteers who help prioritise services. So do you know what, if we are temporarily going to have to reduce our services, who does that need to be? And engaging with staff and volunteers provides a much more meaningful approach to change and allows them to have input in that. And there's going to be less resistance because they're part of that solution. Again, if you use this webinar as an interactive session where you want to consider this with your own organisation, then having a plan for possible futures is a really important. It's a really important activity. It's not something that should be done just when Houston we've got a problem, but it can be done now when the sun's shining, and the what ifs. And the other thing that I would tie into that when we talk about risk, which I think a lot of smaller organisations miss, is what we call management of assumptions. And assumptions are those things that you progress on the basis of, but which you have not tested. So if the local authority have given you a grant for the last 10 years for £20,000 or thereabouts every year, it's very easy to build that into your forecast and say, well, we're going to get it. We've always got it. It's always been there, so we're always going to get it. Managing assumptions and say, do we know we're going to get it? Have we had a letter saying, yeah, the 20,000 is going to be in your account, you know, in March as usual? Or are we assuming that it's going to come? And going back to earlier in the webinar, horizon scanning, should we be talking to the local authority? Are you planning to give us that money again this year? Is there anything that could threaten that? Because we need to have a scenario in case you don't, or you suddenly start trying to top slice it. So scenario planning is a really good way for engaging the whole staff team to have a plan, to look at the assumptions upon which your organisation progresses, and be prepared if the worst happens. So the practical steps for leading organisations through change, and really what we're talking about here is you know, managing change as a result of something that has happened. If we look at this from an HR point of view and a restructure point of view, they would say there are three basic reasons why you would have change. One is for economic reasons, so either a loss of funding or it's costing too much to deliver the services. Technical reasons, and that might be a shift in the way things are being delivered, which means that the team need to be looked at from the point of view of, you know, is this the best? Have we got the best competencies and roles now? And then operational, which again is, are we able to deliver the service operationally within whatever the change that you're focusing on? So prepare for critical change before it happens by creating a culture of adaptability. I think that's really important. So talking about change with staff and looking at, you know, engaging everyone, even in small changes, encouraging staff to develop a positive attitude to change, which focuses on the opportunities. Yes, you have to mitigate the threats, but also to say everything has an opportunity. Developing staff strategies to keep staff motivated during uncertain times. A lot of people that I talk to say, well, we don't want to tell them how bad it is because they'll leave. Well, I have a number of responses to that. First of all, if it is that bad and you think it's doomsday, You should be telling people have got mortgages and families. You should be telling them it's doomsday. Or you should be saying to them, do you know what? Things are bad, but we've got a plan. And we'd really want you to stay on board to help us get through that plan. That's how you motivate people, not keeping them in the dark. And to develop key takeaways for leaders and members of staff. So giving them, this is what we're doing. This is the plan. The plan may change. This is what we know. It allows people to have something from you that encapsulates where the organisation is, how you're responding to the change, what you're doing about it, and how they can contribute to it, which I think is really, really important. And then finally, in terms of the case study, one of the things that they looked at were to set up small task teams which focused on key areas. What that does is it empowers and motivates staff that don't have to just rely on the senior managers sorting it out, but feel that they've got a role in doing that as well. It's really good for motivation. It helps people be part of the change. We often talk about developing change agents within an organisation, and I think that that's a great way of doing it. And then and then implement peer support meetings where staff can share concerns and solutions. And sometimes people don't want to talk to managers because they feel if they do that they'll be earmarked for, to be the people that are out first. So allowing peer support is a great way of people feeling that they can speak confidentially with staff members. Senior managers, leaders, to make a commitment to regular one-to-one check-ins with employees, particularly those that are most affected by the changes. And I would want to see the board in. If you're going to lose staff, I would want the board, representatives for the board to come and talk to staff as well and say, this is what we're doing. We do take it seriously. We do value you, and this is how we're dealing with it. And again, if you were wanting to do this as an exercise, then I would say look at how do you currently take staff through, support staff and volunteers through difficult times. So I think in terms of this from a webinar point of view, I'm going to stop there.